The 41st millennium is a place where prayers are louder than gunfire, and hope is rationed more strictly than ammunition. Across the ash-choked plains of Gthalamor's Reach, faith had failed. Artillery was running dry, and the sky itself had torn open like a suppurating wound. Warp lightning clawed downward through bruised clouds, illuminating the silhouettes of screaming daemons as they poured from a rift large enough to swallow a city spire. To the men and women of the Astra Militarum's 88th Vortigern Line Regiment, this was the end. They had fought for 17 hours without reinforcement. Vox traffic was reduced to static and dying prayers. Commissar Havelock was already dead, torn in half by something that had once been human. And still, the rift grew. In the 41st millennium, this should have been just another forgotten battlefield. One more name added to a list too long for remembrance. But the galaxy had made a mistake. It had reached too far, clawed too greedily at a hell it did not understand. And something answered. No drop pod screamed through the clouds. No thunderhawk cut the sky. There was no warning on Auspex. No fluctuation that the regiment's astropath could sense before his brain boiled in his skull. Instead, reality simply ruptured. A vertical scar of green-white light split the air above the battlefield, utterly distinct from the warp rift's sickly purples and reds. It was clean, violent, precise. The ground detonated outward as something fell from that wound in space, striking the earth with enough force to vaporize a Lehman Russ and throw men like broken dolls across the trench lines. For a heartbeat, everything went silent. Then the screaming started again, this time from the daemons. The thing that rose from the crater was not large by the galaxy's standards. It was not a god. It did not radiate psychic pressure or warp corruption. It did not speak, but it stood wreathed in heat distortion, its armor scorched and unfamiliar, marked by no imperial sigil, no chaos rune, no xenos geometry anyone could name. Green optics flared to life within a helm shaped for war, not worship. In its gauntleted hands was a weapon that hummed with restrained violence, its mechanisms whining as if eager. Private Jorn Valls did not know why he hadn't run. Later, if he lived, he would tell himself it was shock, that his legs had locked, that his mind had finally broken after too many hours of watching reality dissolve into teeth and claws. But in that moment, staring at the armored figure as it stepped out of the smoking crater, he felt something he hadn't felt since the invasion began. Not hope, certainty. The nearest daemon, a towering brute of brass and muscle, its axe dripping with burning ichor, charged with a roar that shattered men's eardrums. It never reached its target. The armored stranger raised its weapon and fired. The sound was wrong. Not a lasgun's crack or a bolter's thunder, but a concussive roar that punched the air flat. The daemon's chest ceased to exist. What remained collapsed into ash and fragments that did not dissolve back into the warp. They simply stopped. The battlefield froze. Then the stranger moved. What followed was not a battle. It was a purge. The armored figure advanced without hesitation, without wasted motion, firing, reloading, switching weapons, with mechanical efficiency that bordered on obscene. Daemons died in droves, torn apart by ballistics, energy, and brutal close-quarters strikes that left scorched craters where warp things had stood. Where most weapons merely banished daemons temporarily, these kills were final. Bodies did not scream back into unreality. They disintegrated, burned, or collapsed into inert matter that twitched and then went still. Sergeant Crail found himself shouting orders without realizing it, his voice hoarse as he directed fire to support the stranger's advance. The men followed him instinctively. Lasguns cracked, heavy bolters roared. But all of it felt secondary, like background noise to the relentless violence unfolding at the rift's edge. The stranger charged directly into the densest concentration of enemies, plunging into the warp-spawned tide as if it were merely terrain to be crossed. Somewhere above, the warp rift shuddered. The daemons reacted with something like panic. Lesser entities scattered. Greater ones roared challenges, hurling sorcery that should have flayed flesh from bone. It washed over the armored warrior and did nothing. The figure did not slow. It did not dodge. It did not acknowledge the metaphysical assault at all. It leapt, slammed into a horned monstrosity twice its size, and tore it apart with its bare hands, argent green energy flaring briefly as if in response to rage itself. Within minutes, the battlefield was transformed. The rift began to contract, not stabilized by ritual or prayer, but destabilized by absence. Whatever sustained it was being annihilated faster than it could replenish itself. The sky screamed as the wound collapsed inward, folding space with a thunderclap that flattened trenches and knocked men senseless. When it was over, the silence returned. Private Valst realized he was crying. Around him, hardened soldiers stared at the lone figure, standing amid the corpses of things that should not have died so completely. Smoke drifted through the air, carrying the stench of burned ozone and something sharp and metallic that hurt to breathe. The armored warrior stood motionless for a long moment, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then it turned, green optics sweeping across the survivors. Weapons were raised hesitantly. "Hold!" Sergeant Krail croaked, though his hands shook. "Hold fire!" The figure did not respond. It took a step forward, and men flinched despite themselves. No imperial litanies adorned its armor. No Aquila watched over it. And yet, it had done what the Emperor's finest had failed to do. It had ended the incursion. Vox units crackled back to life as the warp interference faded. Panicked reports flooded the command net. Requests for identification, threat assessments, demands from Orbital Command to explain why a chaos breach had collapsed without sanction. Far above, on ships that had been preparing cyclonic torpedoes, inquisitorial augurs began to rerun their data. Something had arrived without the warp. Something had killed daemons permanently. That alone was enough to warrant extermination. The armored figure finally moved again, turning away from the soldiers and toward the horizon, where the land still burned. It checked its weapons with practiced ease. Argent energy levels flickered across its HUD, lower than optimal, regeneration sluggish in this alien reality. The Slayer registered the change, cataloged it, dismissed it. Hell was different here, louder, hungrier, but it was still hell. And hell was his domain. Behind him, the men of the 88th Vortigern line stood in stunned silence as their savior, if that was what he was, walked alone into the smoke, leaving behind a battlefield that should have been their grave. None of them noticed the faint shimmer of distant auger locks tightening around the anomaly's last known position. The Imperium had survived the day. The galaxy had not survived what came with it. The smoke did not clear so much as it thinned, unraveling into long, bitter strands that clung to the ruined plains of Gthalamor's reach, like the afterimage of a nightmare. What remained of the battlefield was wrong in ways every guardsman present could feel but not articulate. Daemonic corpses were not supposed to lie still. They were meant to dissolve, to scream their way back into the warp, leaving behind scorched earth and madness. Instead, charred husks littered the ground, twisted, inert, and horrifyingly real. The men avoided looking at them for too long. Reality felt fragile here, as if staring too hard might tear it again. Sergeant Krail moved through the trenches with the stiffness of a man whose body was still obeying orders his mind had not caught up with. He barked instructions automatically establish perimeter, check ammunition, treat the wounded, but his eyes kept drifting toward the direction the armored stranger had gone. The thing had not waited for thanks, had not even acknowledged the regiment once the killing was done. It had simply left, as though the men were irrelevant. In truth, they were. Private Valst sat on an overturned ammo crate, hands trembling as he tried to reassemble his lasgun for the third time. The weapon felt absurdly fragile now. He had watched the stranger fire weapons that tore holes in reality, had seen it tear apart a daemon prince with brute strength and savage precision. Compared to that, his lasgun felt like a child's toy. He swallowed hard and forced his breathing to slow. Around him, the regiment whispered, "Did you see it tear that thing in half? That wasn't a space marine. Too fast, too angry, didn't pray once, didn't even look at the Aquila. He didn't need to. The last comment earned its speaker a sharp look, followed by hurried murmurs of appeasement. Faith was survival. Everyone knew that. But doubt had crept in, insidious and unwelcome. If the Emperor protected, then what had that been? Above them, the sky rumbled as Imperial gunships finally arrived, their engines roaring with righteous fury that felt, to the survivors, strangely late. Valkyries swept low, deploying squads of stormtroopers who fanned out with disciplined efficiency. Their weapons tracked constantly, not just the horizon but the soldiers themselves, as if the entire battlefield were now suspect. Krail straightened as a black-armored figure disembarked from the lead transport. The rosette at the man's chest gleamed dully in the ashlight. Inquisitor Malrek Voss did not waste time on pleasantries. His gaze swept the scene in a cold, clinical arc, taking in the demonic remains, the collapsed rift scar, and finally, the stunned guardsman. "Report," Voss said. Krail complied, recounting the arrival, the fighting, the impossible efficiency of the unknown warrior. He chose his words carefully, avoiding anything that sounded like reverence. The Inquisitor listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. "And this entity," Voss said when Krail finished, "it invoked no litanies, displayed no psychic signature, bore no heraldry." "No, my lord. And yet it annihilated a warp breach." "Yes, my lord." Voss nodded slowly. "That was worse, not better." Orders were issued with brutal speed. Vox traffic spiked as orbital assets were retasked, auger sweeps recalibrated to search for the anomaly. Tech priests were summoned to examine the remains, though several balked when initial scans returned results that did not fit any known classification. The Mechanicus disliked things they could not name. Meanwhile, the Slayer moved. He did not slow his pace as he crossed the blackened plains, boots crunching over slag and bone. His internal systems adapted continuously, filtering out the unfamiliar atmospheric toxins, compensating for gravity fluctuations, recalibrating threat profiles based on this universe's unique hostility. Argent energy flowed through his armor, steady but diminished, the ambient hellscape of this galaxy less compatible with his usual means of replenishment. He noted it, adjusted his projected engagement thresholds, and continued. Combat was inevitable. It always was. The first sign came not from the warp, but from humanity. The whine of engines cut through the haze as Valkyries banked hard, their door gunners tracking the lone figure below. The Slayer registered them instantly. Human, militarized, hostile posture pending. He did not alter course. A warning crackled from external speakers, distorted by distance and interference. "Unidentified combatant, you are ordered to halt and submit to Imperial authority immediately." The Slayer ignored it. Heavy bolter fire raked the ground ahead of him, a line of explosive shells kicking up debris in a deliberate show of force. He stopped, finally, and turned his helm upward. Green optics locked onto the nearest aircraft. Threat assessed. Low. He raised his weapon. The Valkyrie exploded mid-air, its engines detonating in a fireball that sent flaming wreckage spiraling into the ground. The other gunships veered away in panic, their pilots shouting overlapping distress calls. The message was received. On the ground, stormtroopers opened fire. Hotshot lasguns seared the air. Disciplined volleys aimed center mass. The Slayer advanced through it, shots impacting his armor and dissipating harmlessly. He returned fire with surgical brutality, targeting weapons, engines, command units. He did not kill unnecessarily, but he did not hesitate either. Resistance was neutralized in seconds. Inquisitor Voss watched the feeds from orbit, jaw tightening. This was not a daemon, not xenos, as far as he could tell. It did not corrupt. It did not speak. It did not flee. It simply advanced toward objectives and erased anything in its path. Worse, it had demonstrated something the Inquisition found deeply unsettling. It had chosen not to kill everyone. "That implies judgment," Voss muttered. "Or restraint." Neither was acceptable. As the Slayer moved beyond the wreckage, the ground ahead trembled. The air grew thick, heavy with the psychic pressure of something vast awakening. He slowed, recognizing the sensation. This was closer to what he knew. Not hell as he remembered it, but kin to it. The warp churned ahead, coalescing into a knot of malice that promised violence. Good. From a ridge of twisted metal and bone, a host of daemons emerged, drawn by the slaughter, eager to test this interloper that had dared deny them their due. The Slayer lowered his stance, weapons cycling as he prepared for sustained engagement. Argent reserves dipped, then stabilized. He would need to be efficient, brutal, exact. Behind him, Imperial forces regrouped, uncertain whether to assist or withdraw. Vox channels buzzed with conflicting orders. Some officers argued that the anomaly was their best weapon against chaos. Others insisted it was the greatest heresy imaginable. The Slayer did not care. As the daemons charged, he surged forward to meet them, a living engine of destruction in a galaxy that suddenly had to confront a terrifying possibility, a being that fought chaos not for faith, not for survival, but because annihilation was its purpose. Far above, Inquisitor Voss issued a single, quiet command. Mark the target, full priority. Whatever it is, it cannot be allowed to exist unchecked. The hunt had begun. The first thing the Inquisition did was stop calling it a miracle. Inquisitor Malrek Voss stood within the strategium of the Lex Talionis, a black-hulled strike cruiser whose interior was more shrine than command deck. Candles burned in alcoves beside cogitator banks. Cherub servitors drifted through incense fog, their vox throats murmuring fragments of catechism as data streams scrolled across their augmetic eyes. Every surface bore etched wards against corruption. None of it made Voss feel safer. On the central hololith, the anomaly replayed itself again and again. The figure walked through gunfire. The figure annihilated daemons permanently. The figure disengaged at will. Voss watched in silence, hands clasped behind his back. He had purged worlds for less. "Confirm again," he said quietly. The robed figure beside the console interrogator Silex, half her skull replaced with augmetics, nodded. "No detectable warp signature, Lord. No psychic emission consistent with sanctioned psychers, sorcerers, or daemons. Auspex registers extreme energy output, non-warp based, unknown classification. And the rift collapse? Not ritual, not null field. It appears the demonic presence sustaining the breach was removed." "Removed," Voss echoed, as in destroyed. "Yes, Lord." Voss turned away from the hololith and looked instead to the viewing port, where the stars burned cold and indifferent. Daemons were not supposed to be destroyed. Even the Grey Knights understood that banishment was the best one could hope for. Yet this thing had erased them with the casual efficiency of a professional exterminator. That alone placed it beyond tolerance. "Deploy the hunters," Voss said. Within minutes, orders rippled outward. Kill teams were assembled from the most fanatically loyal assets available. Tempestus Scions, Deathwatch observers, operating under sealed mandate, and a small cadre of Sisters of Silence, whose presence would nullify most warp-based anomalies. If the thing was psychic, they would smother it. If it was technological, they would dissect it. If it was divine, they would test its blood. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Slayer tore through the daemon host that had risen to challenge him. These were not the lesser things he had annihilated earlier. These were heavier, denser, with warp stuff, their forms stabilized by hatred and hunger refined across millennia. They screamed his presence into the Imperium as they charged, blades and claws tearing rents in the air itself. The Slayer answered with violence. He moved like a weapon being fired repeatedly, each motion feeding into the next with relentless momentum. Shotgun blasts cored through torsos that regenerated too slowly to matter. Energy weapons flayed warp flesh down to nothing. When ammunition ran dry, he did not retreat, he closed, crushing skulls, tearing limbs free, pulping entities that had devoured civilizations. Argent energy flared brighter with every kill, reacting not to the warp, but to the act of slaughter itself. It was not corrupted. It was not tempted. It was purpose-made. The daemons began to hesitate. That, more than anything, marked the moment when the Imperium took true notice. A pressure rolled across the battlefield, heavier than gravity, thick with layered malice. The air screamed. Reality bent. Lesser daemons were crushed flat, their essence consumed by something far greater, pushing through the veil. The ground split as a towering figure emerged, its form a grotesque parody of strength and command, horned, armored, crowned in writhing symbols of dominion. A daemon lord. It spoke, its voice 1,000 overlapping snarls. You are not of this realm. You do not belong to any god. The Slayer said nothing. The daemon laughed, a sound like grinding steel. Then you will kneel to one. The Slayer charged. The fight that followed shook the plains. Warp fire clashed against argent-fueled fury, each blow tearing chunks from the landscape. The daemon lord wielded sorcery capable of annihilating battle tanks, but its spells slid off the Slayer's armor, or were absorbed into systems that translated the assault into raw data. Threat, force, angle, counter. The Slayer adapted. He ripped the daemon's arm free and beat it to death with it. When it was over, the daemon lord collapsed in a heap of dissolving filth, its essence unraveling in a way that sent shockwaves rippling through the warp itself. Across the sector, astropaths screamed as something fundamental screamed back. On the Lex Talionis, alarms flared. Massive warp disturbance, Silex reported. Localized, then gone. Voss stared at the hololith as the daemon lord's icon winked out entirely. Not banished, not dispersed, erased. This cannot continue, he said. Back on the ground, the Slayer stood amid the remains, armor scarred but intact. Argent levels dipped sharply, then stabilized again at a lower baseline. He registered the loss. This universe resisted him more than hell ever had. It demanded more from him. Fine. He turned and froze. The air behind him shimmered, not with warp lightning but with something colder, emptier. Figures emerged without sound, their presence and absence. A void that made his systems spike warnings across his HUD. Sisters of Silence. Their null aura pressed against him, dampening sensory input, interfering with argent flow in subtle but noticeable ways. New variable. Dangerous. Bolter muzzles tracked him from elevated positions. Scions took firing stances, weapons locked and ready. A voice boomed from amplified speakers. Unidentified entity, Voss intoned from orbit. You stand accused of extreme heresy, unsanctioned warfare, and existential threat to the Imperium of man. Lay down your arms and submit for immediate containment. The Slayer scanned the perimeter. Probability matrices updated. He could fight. He would win at cost. Argent reserves were not optimal. The null field complicated matters. More importantly, the humans were not his enemy. Yet, he took a step forward. Weapons tightened on him. Voss watched closely. This was the moment. Submission or confirmation. The Slayer stopped. He did not kneel. He did not drop his weapons. He simply stood, unmoving, like a loaded gun refusing to misfire. That is refusal, Voss said calmly. Terminate. The Sisters of Silence advanced, their presence biting deeper into the Slayer's systems. Argent flow stuttered, not gone, but muted. He felt it like a pressure against his chest, a reminder that this universe had counters to everything. He acted. In a blur of motion, he vaulted over the advancing line, smashing through scions with controlled force, disabling rather than killing where possible. Bolter rounds detonated against his armor. One found a joint and staggered him briefly, data logged, compensation applied. He reached the Sisters last. They struck with blades that hummed with null energy, cutting deeper than any daemon claw had. The Slayer grunted as argent output dipped further. This was bad. He retaliated with precision, knocking them aside without lethal force. He did not want this fight, but he would finish it if forced. Before escalation could tip into massacre, the ground shook again. Not warp, something else. Deep, resonant, mechanical. From the horizon came a sound like grinding mountains. Every auspex flared. Every cogitator screamed. Something ancient had noticed the anomaly, and it was moving. The sound rolled across Gathalamor's reach, like the groan of a world being woken against its will. It was not the shriek of the warp, nor the thunder of artillery or engines. It was older, deeper, a grinding resonance that vibrated through bedrock and bone alike, setting teeth on edge and making cogitators stutter, as if reality itself were struggling to remember the correct sequence of events. The Slayer felt it immediately. His internal sensors lit up with warnings not tied to heat, energy, or motion, but to something far more fundamental. Mass displacement without visible cause. Geometric inconsistencies in the terrain ahead. Probability curves bending inward, collapsing toward a singular point beneath the plains. Whatever was coming was not chaos. It was not human, and it was not alive in any way he recognized. He disengaged from the Sisters of Silence in a single backward leap, landing amid shattered rock as the Imperial kill teams instinctively pulled back. Even the Null Maidens paused, their featureless masks turning toward the horizon as the pressure in the air intensified. Bolter muzzles wavered, then steadied again, but no one fired. Some instincts ran deeper than indoctrination. Inquisitor Voss watched the live feed in silence as the Auspex overlays went mad. "Report," he snapped. "Subterranean structure breach," Interrogator Silex replied, fingers flying over rune keys. No warp signature, no bio readings. Power output, incomprehensible. Pattern does not match known xenos classifications. Necron, Voss asked. Possibly, but scale is excessive. The ground split open, not in an explosion, but in a deliberate mechanical separation, as if titanic hands were prying the planet apart along preordained fault lines. Monolithic slabs of blackened stone rose, revealing structures beneath that glowed with sickly green light. Towering forms emerged angular, impossibly precise, their surfaces etched with symbols that hurt to look at. Engines hummed without sound, energy crackled without heat. Necrons, not a raiding force, not a tomb awakening cautiously. This was a full emergence. The Slayer stood motionless, as legions of skeletal warriors marched forth in perfect synchronization. Gauss weapons snapping into firing position. At their center rose a massive construct, its form a fusion of fortress and war engine, eyes blazing with ancient intelligence. A command node, a ruler. The Imperials panicked. "Fall back! Fall back!" officers shouted as discipline fractured under the sheer wrongness of the sight. Lascun fire lanced out reflexively, splashing harmlessly against living metal that repaired itself even as it was damaged. Gauss beams answered, slicing guardsmen apart molecule by molecule with clinical indifference. The Sisters of Silence retreated in tight formation, their null auras rippling uselessly against enemies that did not draw from the warp. Tempestus Scions died where they stood, their elite training meaningless against a foe that had outlived empires. The Slayer moved. This was not his war. Not yet, but it was a battlefield, and something here was killing humans in vast numbers. That was enough. He sprinted forward, weaving through Gauss fire with bursts of impossible speed, closing the distance before the Necron lines could fully adjust. His weapons barked, rounds punching into necrodermis with brute force rather than esoteric banishment. Limbs shattered, torsos exploded. The Necrons fell and then began to rise again, systems reknitting with eerie efficiency. Data streamed across his HUD, self-repair protocols, distributed consciousness. No soul, no fear. Problematic. He switched tactics instantly, targeting joints, power cores, command relays. Where chaos was rage and hunger, these things were logic and inevitability. He adapted, ripping weapons from fallen constructs and turning them back on their masters, argent energy flaring as his systems brute-forced compatibility with alien tech. For the first time since his arrival, the Slayer encountered resistance that did not scream. At the center of the emerging complex, the towering Necron ruler turned its gaze upon him. Its voice boomed outward, not through sound but through direct transmission into every cogitator and augmetic receiver in range. Anomaly identified. Non-warp entity. Threat index. Escalating. The Slayer felt a pulse of energy wash over him, scanning, dissecting, analyzing. His armor's countermeasures flared, blocking intrusion with sheer computational violence. The Necron paused, head tilting minutely. Fascinating. Imperial forces were in full retreat now, scrambling for extraction under relentless Gauss fire. Valkyries burned in the sky. Vox channels dissolved into screams and static. Inquisitor Voss watched the carnage with clenched fists. "This world is lost," he said. "Prepare exterminatus protocols." Silex hesitated. "Lord, the anomaly is still engaged. It's slowing the Necron advance." Voss's eyes flicked back to the hololith. The Slayer stood alone amid a sea of living metal, tearing through constructs that should have overwhelmed him by sheer attrition. It was effective, horrifyingly so. "No," Voss said softly. "That makes it worse." On the ground, the Slayer realized the truth quickly. This was not a skirmish. This was an awakening. Even he could not slaughter an entire tomb world's worth of machines alone, not without time, resources, and a way to stop them from simply reassembling. His Argent reserves dipped again, regeneration slowed by constant output. Efficiency mattered now more than fury. He made a decision. With a burst of speed that shattered stone beneath his boots, he disengaged, sprinting toward the exposed command structure at the heart of the complex. Necron fire tracked him, carving trenches through the earth, but he pressed on, leaping impossible distances, closing the gap before targeting algorithms could fully adjust. He reached the structure and planted a device scavenged from his own arsenal, overcharged with Argent energy and jury-rigged to interface violently with alien systems. He did not know if it would work. He did not need to. He only needed it to disrupt. He triggered it and leapt clear. The explosion was not loud. It was silent and devastating. A wave of cascading system failures rippled outward, Necron forms stuttering, collapsing, their self-repair routines locked in endless loops. The massive command construct staggered, its glow flickering as its control over the emerging legions faltered. It was not destroyed, but it was delayed. The Slayer did not wait to see more. He turned and ran, vanishing into the smoke and ruin as the Necron struggled to reassert control. Behind him, the battlefield burned anew, this time under cold, merciless green light. From orbit, Inquisitor Voss watched the Slayer disappear from Auspec's range. "He chose," Voss said. "Not us. Not them." "What now?" Silex asked. Voss's expression hardened. "Now we decide whether he's an asset or the greatest liability the Imperium has ever faced." Far below, the Slayer moved toward the next horizon. Armor scorched, Argent reserves low but stable. This galaxy was not hell. It was worse in some ways. Smarter, older, but it still bled, and he would keep making it bleed until his purpose was fulfilled or until it finally found a way to stop him. The warp does not think as mortals do. It does not observe events in linear sequence, nor does it care for geography or time in any way that makes sense to sane minds. But it does react. It ripples. It recoils. And when something occurs that violates its ancient assumptions, the Imperium takes notice in the only way it knows how, by screaming. Across the sector, astropaths clutched their skulls and bled from their eyes as nightmares not their own flooded their minds. Daemons recoiled mid-manifestation, their forms stuttering as if reality itself had rejected them. Warp currents shifted unpredictably, snarling established roots and vomiting half-formed horrors into the void. Something was wrong. Something was killing them. Not banishing, not dispersing, killing. In the shifting madness of the warp, where the chaos gods brooded upon their thrones of excess, decay, rage, and change, attention began to focus. Not fully, not yet, but enough to stir irritation, curiosity, and something dangerously close to concern. On 1,000 daemon worlds, lesser entities whispered the same fractured truth. The anomaly hunts. The anomaly does not feed the warp. The anomaly ends us. That alone made it intolerable. The Slayer did not hear the warp's cries. He felt only the practical consequences. The air grew thicker with resistance as he crossed the shattered Badlands beyond the Necron emergence zone, every step taking him farther from Imperial lines and deeper into contested space. His armor logged increased ambient hostility. Reality here bent more aggressively, as if the universe itself were pushing back. Argent energy regeneration slowed further. Not catastrophically, not yet, but enough to demand discipline. He adjusted his combat parameters, disabling non-essential systems, rerouting power from redundant shielding to weapon stabilization. His movements became even more economical, every action stripped of excess. Rage was not diminished, but it was focused, honed into something colder. He crested a ridge and saw the next battlefield before he heard it. Below, an Imperial mining settlement burned. Hab blocks lay in ruins, their plasteel skeletons jutting like broken ribs. Civilians ran in blind terror as cultists surged through the streets, chanting praises to powers that promised ascension through slaughter. Above them all loomed a half-formed warp gate, pulsing with sickly light as daemons clawed their way into being. The Slayer did not hesitate. He descended like an executioner. The cultists died first, not because they were the greatest threat, but because they were closest. He tore through them with brutal efficiency, weapons flashing, bones shattering, blood spraying across rusted machinery. They screamed prayers as they died. It did not help them. The daemons followed, emerging half-formed and vulnerable. The Slayer exploited that ruthlessly, destroying them before their connection to the warp could stabilize. Each kill sent a ripple through the Imperium, a feedback shock that made the warp gate flicker erratically. Above, something noticed. The gate convulsed, its structure warping as a will pressed through it, vast and furious. A presence like burning hatred and molten iron poured into the half-formed breach, forcing it wider through sheer dominance. The air ignited. Gravity buckled. A champion of chaos forced its way into reality, towering and wreathed in warp flame. Its armor fused to its flesh in a mockery of permanence. It roared a challenge that shook the settlement to its foundations. The Slayer looked up at it and switched weapons. The battle was savage and fast. The champion struck with strength that could pulverize tanks, its blows tearing chunks from the ground and sending shockwaves through the air. The Slayer absorbed the impacts, redirected force, countered with precise violence aimed not at flesh, but at the warp anchors binding the creature to reality. Argent energy flared brightly, then dipped alarmingly as the fight dragged on. Warning indicators pulsed across his HUD. Sustained output, environmental incompatibility, energy recovery suboptimal. He finished the champion anyway, tearing its core apart with a final, brutal strike that detonated its essence inward. The warp gate screamed and collapsed, imploding in a vortex of displaced reality that sucked the remaining daemons into nothingness. Silence followed. The Slayer stood alone amid the ruins, armor scorched, systems humming as they stabilized. Argent levels were lower now, noticeably so. He registered the trend without emotion. This universe demanded attrition. It demanded sacrifice. Fine. He turned to leave and stopped. The air rippled again, this time not with immediate violence, but with presence. Figures emerged from the shadows of the ruined Habs, their forms wrong in subtler ways than daemons. Armored warriors, bearing sigils of chaos, but unmarked by madness, approached cautiously, weapons lowered but ready. At their head walked a tall figure clad in Baroque power armor, his movements deliberate, controlled. A traitor Astartes. Impressive, the warrior said, his voice distorted but steady. You kill daemons as if they were cattle. You do not bend to the warp. That makes you interesting. The Slayer did not respond. The traitor smiled behind his helm. The gods are aware of you now. They are not pleased, but they are curious. Serve, and you will never lack for prey again. Resist, and you will be hunted across eternity. The Slayer raised his weapon. The traitor laughed softly. So be it. The fight was brief and vicious. The traitor Marines fought with centuries of experience, coordinated and relentless. The Slayer matched them blow for blow, adapting instantly to their tactics, exploiting weaknesses with surgical brutality. When it was over, the street was littered with broken ceramite and inert bodies. No daemons came for their souls. That silence echoed louder than any scream. Far away, in places where reality thinned and the warp pressed close, something vast shifted its attention fully now. Not in unity, chaos never acted so simply, but in shared recognition of a threat that could not be ignored. The anomaly was not a tool. It was not prey. It was a problem. And problems, in the long history of the warp, were either consumed or erased. As the Slayer disappeared once more into the wasteland, unaware of the full weight of what now watched him, the galaxy edged closer to a truth it would not welcome. For the first time in 10,000 years, chaos had found something it could not easily corrupt, bargain with, or escape, and it was coming for them. The warp's response was not immediate, but it was absolute. Across the Imperium, currents twisted into unnatural spirals as something like consensus formed among entities that normally agreed on nothing. The Slayer's actions had not merely disrupted demonic incursions, they had damaged the economy of damnation itself. Souls were not cycling. Fear was not ripening. Rage was not feeding the gods as it should. Entire hosts were being erased without replenishment. This was intolerable. On a moonless world, long claimed by chaos, reality convulsed as a ritual of obscene scale was enacted. Millions of cultists died screaming as their blood powered a summoning not meant for a single daemon, but for a convergence. Warp space folded inward, compressing layers of immaterial force into something dense, focused, and deliberately shaped to counter the anomaly. A hunting ground was chosen. The Slayer entered it unknowingly. The world was a corpse of industry, its surface a labyrinth of rusted manufactoria and collapsed spires stretching from horizon to horizon. The sky churned constantly, clouds forming and dissolving in impossible geometries. Vox static whispered at the edge of audibility, bleeding half-formed words into the air. This place was soaked in warp saturation, the kind that turned prolonged exposure into madness for ordinary soldiers. The Slayer's armor flagged it immediately. Ambient hostility. Extreme. Warp density. Critical. Argent interaction. Unstable but functional. He slowed his pace not from fear, but calculation. Here, brute force alone would be inefficient. The warp was thick enough to interfere with targeting solutions, to cause spatial drift that made straight lines unreliable. His HUD compensated constantly, recalibrating trajectories milliseconds before execution. He moved anyway. The first wave came without warning. The ground ruptured as daemons clawed their way free, emerging in coordinated formations rather than the usual frenzied swarms. These were not rabble. These were hunters, leaner, faster, their forms bound by sigils designed to resist annihilation rather than mere banishment. They struck from multiple vectors, blades shimmering with warp-enhanced lethality. The Slayer answered with precision. He did not charge blindly this time. He baited them, drawing them into narrow corridors between collapsed structures where their numbers worked against them. Shotgun blasts thundered in confined spaces, turning warp flesh into incandescent mist. Energy weapons flared, tuned to frequencies that disrupted cohesion rather than mass, causing daemons to destabilize long enough for final destruction. It worked. For a while, then the warp adapted. Reality warped violently as the environment itself turned hostile. Walls twisted, corridors stretched impossibly, distances elongating or collapsing without warning. Daemons began phasing mid-attack, slipping partially out of reality to avoid lethal strikes. The Slayer's systems struggled to keep up, compensatory algorithms burning processing power at alarming rates. Argent reserves dipped again. He registered the loss with a flicker of irritation, not fear. He had faced worse odds. But this was different. Hell had rules. This place rewrote them. A roar shook the Manufactorum district as something vast manifested overhead, its presence pressing down like a physical weight. The sky tore open, not into a single rift but into dozens of overlapping wounds, each vomiting warp energy into a growing nexus. From within, it descended a being of composite form, its body an amalgam of multiple demonic archetypes, bound together by raw god-wrought will. A designed counter. It spoke with many voices layered into one. You destroy what feeds us. You end what should endure. This cannot be permitted. The Slayer braced as the creature attacked, its blows bending gravity, its presence scrambling sensor data into incoherence. His armor screamed warnings as null spikes and warp lashes tore chunks from his plating, breaching secondary systems and forcing emergency reroutes. Argent output spiked dangerously as he pushed back, matching impossible strength with impossible violence. They clashed amid collapsing structures, each impact reshaping the battlefield. The Slayer adapted mid-fight, switching tactics repeatedly, testing responses, mapping vulnerabilities in real time. He found them not in the creature's flesh, but in the sigils binding its composite form together. He targeted those. The fight turned brutal. The daemon howled as its cohesion began to fail, its many forms fighting each other as the binding weakened. The Slayer pressed the advantage mercilessly, tearing into the creature's core with sustained fire that drained Argent reserves to critical levels. Warning: Argent levels low. Regeneration halted. Efficiency compromised. He ignored it. With a final, bone-shaking strike, he shattered the sigil nexus and ripped the creature apart from the inside, unleashing a shockwave that flattened everything for kilometers. When the light faded, nothing remained of the daemon, not even residue. The warp recoiled violently. The Slayer dropped to one knee, armor venting heat and fractured energy. Systems rebooted in staggered sequence. Argent levels stabilized at a dangerously low baseline, functional, but fragile. This universe was starving him, slowly but inexorably. He stood anyway. Above him, the sky screamed not in anger, but in warning. Far beyond mortal perception, the Chaos Gods ceased their individual games and turned their collective attention fully toward the anomaly. Not as a curiosity now, not as a challenge, as an existential threat. On the Lex Talionis, Inquisitor Voss watched the data scroll past in grim silence. Warp disturbances of unprecedented pattern. Demonic casualties spiking without corresponding manifestations. Entire cult networks collapsing as their patrons withdrew or were annihilated. He's forcing adaptation at the divine level, Silex whispered. That shouldn't be possible. Voss's expression was iron. Everything is possible if you violate enough assumptions. And if he keeps doing this? Voss looked out at the stars, imagining a galaxy where the warp itself learned fear. Then the Imperium may have to decide which terror it can live with. On the corpse world below, the Slayer resumed his march through twisted reality, armor scarred, energy low, purpose undiminished. The warp was learning. So was he. Every engagement carved away illusions, revealing this galaxy for what it truly was, a machine of endless suffering, powered by gods that fed on despair. He would keep tearing at it until it broke, or until it finally broke him. And somewhere deep in the Imperium, something ancient and patient began to plan a far more personal response. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not fear the Slayer. Fear was an emotion of inefficient variables, a chemical inefficiency long ago rendered obsolete by augmetics and liturgy. What the priesthood of Mars felt instead was something far more dangerous: reverence. Across forge worlds and data vaults, red-robed figures whispered Binharic prayers as corrupted Auspex logs, and fragmented battlefield recordings were decrypted and reassembled. They replayed the footage endlessly, the anomaly advancing through daemon fire, weapons cycling with machine-perfect rhythm, armor withstanding energies that should have atomized it. Most importantly, they isolated the data that made lesser magi lock their cogitators in self-protective loops. Power generation without warp dependence, weapon systems incompatible with STC logic, armor materials exhibiting adaptive resilience without machine spirits. To the Mechanicus, this was not heresy. It was blasphemous potential. Archmagos Dominus Kepra, 9 of Forge World Vos Prime, convened a sealed synod within a chamber of whirring logic engines and suspended data scrolls. His form was barely humanoid anymore, an amalgamation of mechadendrites, sensor arrays, and incense-belching reliquaries, housing what remained of his biological core. The anomaly represents a deviation, Kepra 9 intoned, vox-modulated voice echoing with harmonic distortion. Deviation implies error. Error implies correction. Or acquisition, countered Magos Explorator Heliax, her cranial augmetics glowing softly. The machine it wears is not corrupted. It resists the warp. This contradicts all established parameters. We must learn. Learning requires disassembly, Kepra 9 replied, preferably while operational. The decision was unanimous. A retrieval expedition was authorized under the highest secrecy, its purpose cloaked behind the pretense of a joint inquisitorial operation. Skitarii legions were mobilized, their cybernetic bodies optimized for rapid deployment and overwhelming firepower. Specialized containment fields were prepared, experimental, untested, and dangerously ambitious. The Omnissiah demanded knowledge. On the ground, the Slayer felt the shift before he saw it. The air changed as he entered the outskirts of an abandoned forge complex, its titanic manufactoria looming like dead gods against a smog-choked sky. This place had once been sacred to the machine cult. Now it was silent, its forges cold, its data looms stripped or corrupted beyond salvage. Too quiet. His sensors picked up electromagnetic signatures buried beneath layers of debris, organized, disciplined, converging. Not daemons, not necrons, human-made, but altered beyond baseline parameters. Skitarii. They emerged in perfect formation, their red cloaks fluttering despite the absence of wind. Augmetic eyes glowed with cold logic as galvanic rifles and plasma calivers were raised in unison. Behind them, towering Castellan robots stomped forward, their combat protocols already cycling through lethal permutations. A voice boomed from concealed speakers, layered with Binharic subharmonics. Anomaly, Kepra 9 intoned. By the authority of the Omnissiah, you will submit for sanctified analysis. Resistance is illogical. The Slayer did not respond. He adjusted his stance, argent reserves flickering at low but stable levels. This would not be a quick engagement. The Mechanicus fought differently, methodically, without fear or hesitation, willing to sacrifice units to gather data. The Skitarii opened fire. Plasma washed over the Slayer in searing waves, overwhelming his armor's heat dissipation systems and forcing emergency venting. Galvanic rounds punched with punishing force, their mass-reactive design optimized to breach heavy plating. Castellan robots advanced through their own fire, fists crackling with power as they closed for melee. The Slayer surged forward. He tore through the Skitarii lines with brutal efficiency, ripping weapons from augmented limbs and turning them back on their owners. He targeted command nodes, severing data links, and forcing localized autonomy that disrupted the machine-precise coordination of the Force. It slowed them, not enough. A containment field snapped into place around him, shimmering with unstable energy that clawed at his armor and made his system scream. Argent flows stuttered, partially suppressed by overlapping frequency interference. This was not warp-based nullification, it was something colder, more calculated. The Mechanicus had learned. The Slayer roared, not in sound, but in action, pouring everything he had into a single, focused burst of violence. He shattered the containment field with sheer output, the backlash throwing him through a manufactorum wall in an explosion of debris. Warning indicators flared red. Structural damage sustained. Argent reserves critical. Efficiency reduced. He stood anyway. Castellan robots closed in, their massive frames blotting out the light as they hammered at him with relentless force. The Slayer adapted again, exploiting micro-delays in their protocol loops, baiting them into overcommitting before dismantling them piece by piece with savage precision. The ground shook as something enormous descended from above. A towering Mechanicus war engine landed amid the ruins, its form bristling with weaponry and sensor arrays. At its heart, entombed within layers of adamantium and circuitry, was Archmagos Kepra 9 himself. "You are inefficient," Kepra 9 declared. "You expend finite energy against infinite opposition. Yield. Be preserved." The Slayer looked up at the machine god construct towering over him. Then he charged it. The fight was catastrophic. Macro weapons tore through the battlefield, reducing ancient structures to molten slag. The Slayer climbed the war engine like a living weapon, tearing into armored plates, destroying sensor clusters, ripping apart sacred mechanisms without hesitation or reverence. Kepra 9 screamed Bin-Harik curses as data flooded his systems. This was not supposed to be possible. The anomaly was learning faster than predictive models could adapt. With a final, desperate act, the Archmagos attempted to interface directly, flooding the Slayer's armor with invasive code designed to overwrite control systems and enslave the machine within. The Slayer's armor rejected it violently. The feedback pulse annihilated Kepra 9's core consciousness in an instant, leaving the war engine to collapse in a thunderous heap. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of burning machinery. The Slayer staggered, dropping to one knee as Argent reserves dipped to their lowest point yet. Systems struggled to maintain baseline function. This universe was draining him slowly, inexorably. He pushed himself upright. From the shadows of the ruined forge, surviving Skitarii withdrew, their logic engines reassessing priorities. Retrieval had failed. Acquisition was impossible. Observation would continue. Far away, Inquisitor Voss received the report and closed his eyes briefly. The Slayer had now defied chaos, Necrons, and the Mechanicus itself. "There will be no containment," Voss said quietly. "Only consequences." On the battlefield, the Slayer turned away from the wreckage and moved on, leaving behind a forge world that would whisper his name in corrupted data streams for centuries. The galaxy had wanted to claim him. It had learned instead that some weapons refused to be owned. The galaxy did not pause to consider what the Slayer had done. It reacted. Signals crossed the void in encrypted bursts and half-corrupted data psalms. Rogue traders whispered of a red-armored ghost that left Daemon worlds silent. Eldar farseers recoiled from futures that ended abruptly. Threads severed where something refused destiny itself. Orc warbosses argued over stories of a shiny Humi that killed monsters bigger than Gargants and kept walking. Even the Tau, distant and cautious, flagged anomalous battlefields where no warp residue remained at all. But the most dangerous response did not come from the stars. It came from desperation. The Slayer entered a broken Imperial frontier system 3 days later, time measured not by clocks, but by the rhythm of violence and recovery cycles. His armor bore scars that would not fully seal. Argent levels remained low but stable, regeneration occurring only in short, inefficient pulses after prolonged combat. He adjusted continuously, suppressing non-essential processes, prioritizing lethality over endurance. He detected the settlement long before he saw it. A collection of void-shielded habs and prefabricated bastions clung to the side of a canyon like a wound hastily stitched shut. Defensive turrets tracked the horizon erratically, powered by generators that screamed under overload. Vox traffic leaked into the air, unshielded panic, argument, prayer, human voices. He approached openly. Spotlights snapped on, bathing him in harsh white beams. Turrets whined as targeting spirits debated whether to fire. The gates did not open. A voice crackled over external speakers. Unidentified armored entity, halt. Identify yourself by Imperial decree. The Slayer stopped. Behind the walls, men and women argued in frantic whispers. Some shouted that it was the thing that killed demons. Others screamed that it was a trick, a lure sent by chaos. Someone began reciting a catechism loudly and incorrectly. The Slayer waited. A single figure emerged atop the wall, flanked by guards with shaking hands. She wore the uniform of a planetary defense officer, her rank insignia scorched and half melted. Her eyes locked onto him through magnoculars, widening as recognition dawned. "It's you," she said softly, then louder. "It's the one from Gthalamor's Reach." Her voice trembled not with fear, but something far more fragile. "Hope, open the gate," she ordered. Arguments erupted instantly, but she cut them down with the authority of someone who had already buried too many friends. The gates groaned open, mechanisms protesting after too much use and too little maintenance. The Slayer stepped inside. The settlement smelled of blood, oil, and desperation. Wounded lay everywhere, Medicae servitors overwhelmed or destroyed. Power flickered. A warp storm loomed on the horizon, its unnatural clouds rolling closer by the hour. The officer approached him slowly. "My name is Captain Illyra Vance," she said. "This world is lost. The Imperium hasn't answered our calls in weeks. Chaos cults infest the lower canyon. Daemons breach nightly. We don't have the strength to hold another day." The Slayer said nothing. Vance swallowed. "But you do." She gestured toward the canyon below, where faint warp light pulsed like a diseased heartbeat. "There's a ritual site down there. A big one. If it completes, this place becomes another Daemon world. If you destroy it, we might evacuate. Some of us. Maybe." The Slayer turned his gaze toward the canyon. Data streamed across his HUD. High warp saturation. Sustained combat likely. Argent reserves insufficient for prolonged engagement without replenishment. Probability of survival for settlement low, even with intervention. He looked back at Vance. She met his gaze without flinching. "We know you don't owe us anything," she said quietly. "But if you're what we think you are, if you really kill them for good, then this might be the only chance these people ever get." Silence stretched. This was not a battlefield in the usual sense. There was no strategic value, no critical infrastructure, no cosmic threat, just humans clinging to existence in a galaxy that had already written them off. The Slayer evaluated the variables. If he left now, his energy reserves might recover slightly over time. He could continue his war against chaos at optimal efficiency. If he stayed, he would expend what little argent he had left in a drawn-out fight, risking catastrophic depletion. Either way, chaos would persist. He turned away from the settlement. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone sobbed. Vance's shoulders slumped, just slightly, as if she had expected nothing else. Then the Slayer stopped. He reached down and slammed a fist into the ground. Argent energy flared weak, but deliberate, sending a shockwave through the settlement's foundations. He pointed toward the canyon. Vance stared, then laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that cracked into tears. "Thank you," she whispered. The Slayer moved immediately. The canyon was worse than he had anticipated. Warp corruption coated every surface. Flesh and metal fused into obscene architecture. Cultists packed the ritual site by the hundreds, their chanting forming a psychic pressure that clawed at his systems. Daemons prowled the perimeter, drawn by the promise of a stable breach. The Slayer descended into it anyway. The fighting was brutal and unrelenting. Every shot was measured. Every movement was optimized. He could not afford waste. Argent energy dipped dangerously low as he tore through cultists and daemons alike, his armor screaming warnings as systems degraded under sustained output. The ritual fought back. Warp energy lashed out, tearing into his armor, flooding his sensors with false data and screaming hallucinations. He ignored it, forcing his way through the nexus of the ritual and planting charges directly into its core. Detonation followed. The canyon shook as the ritual site imploded, dragging half-formed daemons into nothingness and collapsing the warp breach in on itself. The backlash slammed into the Slayer like a freight train, throwing him clear and smashing him into a rock face hard enough to crater it. He lay still. Warning indicators flared wildly. Argent reserves at critical minimum. System integrity compromised. Movement sluggish. For the first time since his arrival in this galaxy, the Slayer was truly vulnerable. Above, the warp storm began to dissipate, its unnatural clouds thinning as the ritual's anchor vanished. The settlement survived. Barely. Rescue ships arrived hours later, rogue traders, not Imperial. They evacuated who they could before the Imperium's attention inevitably returned. The Slayer was gone by then. He moved slowly now, deeper into the wastes. Energy low, but purpose intact. He had made a choice not because it was efficient, but because it mattered. The galaxy took note of that too. Some would call it weakness. Others would learn it was far more dangerous. Stories mutate as they travel. By the time the Slayer's actions reached ears beyond Imperial space, truth had already been stretched, twisted, and sharpened into something more dangerous than fact. On frontier worlds and in void stations far from Terra's dogma, whispers replaced reports. A red-armored revenant, a god-killer without a god, a machine that hated daemons more than orcs hated silence. The xenos listened. On the drifting hulks at the edge of a war-torn system, an orc gathered momentum like a living avalanche. Gargants were being assembled from scrap torn off defeated Imperial armor. Mech boys argued violently over whose designs would explode after killing the most enemies. Warboss Grimsnaga Skullcrack sat atop a pile of looted tanks, teeth bared in a grin that split his scarred face. "Say it again," Grimsnug rumbled. The cowering grot repeated itself quickly. "Red Humie boss, one Humie. Kills daemons good. Kills big shiny metal gets good too. Keeps walking." The warboss laughed, a booming sound that sent lesser orcs scrambling. "One Humie? That's a fight worth having. If he's that tough, he's gotta be the best scrappin' to sector." Orders were barked. Course corrections made. The Wah shifted its trajectory, drawn by the promise of a worthy opponent. Elsewhere, far more quietly, Eldar eyes turned toward the same anomaly. Within the crystalline halls of a craft world, gliding through the void like a dying dream, Farseer Ilthariel stood before a pool of shimmering light. Runes floated around her, spinning erratically, refusing to settle into any pattern she could read. Every future she reached for collapsed into static where the Slayer's path intersected it. "He is not bound," she murmured. "Not to fate, not to the warp." A younger warlock stepped closer. "Nothing exists outside fate." Ilthariel's eyes hardened. "Then this thing is a wound in reality itself." The Eldar had survived 10,000 years by manipulating inevitability, by nudging threads just enough to spare themselves extinction. An entity that severed threads outright without replacing them was terrifying. And yet, there was opportunity there too, if the anomaly could be guided or destroyed. The Slayer remained blissfully ignorant of the debates his existence provoked. He moved through the ruins of a former trade world now reduced to a patchwork of shattered cities and irradiated plains. His pace had slowed measurably since the canyon battle. Argent regeneration was painfully sluggish, flaring only in brief surges after combat before dipping again. Systems compensated, but margins were thin now. One prolonged engagement too many could cripple him. He cataloged threats automatically, adjusting routes to minimize unnecessary conflict. That was when the ground began to shake. Not warp turbulence, not tectonic instability. Footsteps. The horizon darkened as orcs crested the ridgeline in impossible numbers, their ramshackle vehicles belching smoke and fire as they roared in anticipation. Trucks and battle wagons surged forward, guns blazing wildly. At their center strode Warboss Grimsnaga, mega armor crackling with stolen energy fields, power claws snapping open and closed like a predator's jaw. "Oi!" the Warboss bellowed. voice carrying across kilometers. "Red Hume, come here and fight me!" The Slayer stopped. Threat assessment updated rapidly. Orcs. Extreme numbers. High durability. Morale. Infinite. Tactical intelligence. Low, but compensated by sheer aggression. Argent reserves. Insufficient for extended engagement. He considered disengagement. Then the first shell detonated near him, throwing debris skyward. The orcs charged. A green tide of violence that obliterated subtlety through momentum alone. The Slayer moved. He did not meet them head-on. Instead, he darted sideways, drawing the Wah into a narrow stretch of ruined urban terrain, where collapsed habs and skeletal towers limited their numbers. He struck fast and hard, targeting vehicles first, detonating fuel reserves and ammo caches to create chain reactions that tore holes through the advancing horde. Orcs died by the dozens, laughing as they did. The war boss barreled through the wreckage regardless, shrugging off explosions that would have obliterated tanks. He swung his claw, the impact shattering a building and sending the Slayer skidding through rubble. They collided like colliding artillery shells. Grimsnaga was strong, stronger than most things the Slayer had faced since arriving in this galaxy. His blows rang through armor, rattling systems and forcing emergency dampening. The Slayer answered with precision, targeting joints, exposed cabling, weak points in the stolen technology bolted onto the orc's frame. They fought amid fire and wreckage, the Wah screaming approval around them. The Slayer won. He always did. With a final, brutal maneuver, he severed the war boss's power field and drove a killing strike through his chest, tearing out something vital and letting the massive body crash to the ground. The orcs roared not in despair, but excitement. "That WU's amazing," one bellowed as another immediately began fighting his neighbor over leadership. The Wah devolved into infighting within seconds, momentum shattering as orcs turned on each other in gleeful violence. The Slayer disengaged instantly, using the chaos to withdraw before Argent depletion became catastrophic. He had barely cleared the outskirts when reality shifted again. This time, it was subtle. The air cooled, colors dulled, sound seemed to recede slightly, as if muffled by distance. The Slayer's sensors flagged no immediate threat, but probability curves spiked unpredictably. Something was watching him, something that did not announce itself with gunfire or roars. Figures emerged from behind a ruined archway, tall and impossibly graceful, armor gleaming with alien elegance. Eldar, weapons were trained on him, but fingers rested lightly on triggers. At their head stood Farseer Ilthariel, her gaze piercing even through his helm. "You walk through futures like a blade," she said calmly. "Where you pass, nothing grows back." The Slayer remained still. Ilthariel studied him for a long moment. "We have seen what you do to chaos, to the metal dead, to the green hordes. You are a force without destiny." She gestured toward the stars. "That makes you dangerous, but it also makes you useful." She offered him a choice not in words, but implication. Guidance through the webway, targets that mattered, information that could lead him to greater threats, and perhaps to places where his energy could recover, where the warp's resistance was thinner. An alliance, of sorts. The Slayer weighed it silently. Trusting xenos was irrelevant. Efficiency was all that mattered. But he had learned something in the canyon, in the settlement. Choices mattered too. Before he could respond, distant thunder rolled across the sky. Imperial signatures flared on his HUD ships entering the system, weapons charging. The window was closing. Ilthariel inclined her head slightly. "Decide quickly, Anomaly. Fate does not wait." The Slayer looked from the Eldar to the heavens above, where the Imperium's shadow fell long and merciless. Then he moved. The sky burned as Imperial ships translated fully into real space, their arrival tearing luminous scars across the void. Macro cannon batteries rotated into firing alignment. Lance arrays glowed with restrained fury. From orbit, the Imperium did not see a battlefield of competing horrors and impossible variables. It saw a contaminated system requiring decisive purification. Inquisitor Malrek Voss watched the deployment from the command throne of the Lex Talionis, his expression carved from certainty. "He's there," he said, voice calm, despite the chaos flooding the hololithic displays. "I want containment if possible, termination if not." Silex hesitated. "Lord, the Eldar presence complicates. Everything complicates." Voss cut in. "That does not excuse hesitation." Below, the Slayer felt the shift instantly. Orbital targeting solutions snapped into place like invisible nooses tightening around his position. His armor flagged the incoming threat vectors, predicting impact zones with merciless clarity. Even he could not ignore the firepower being brought to bear. The Eldar felt it too. Ilthariel's runes spun wildly, cracking and dissolving, as futures collapsed faster than she could read them. "The Maquis will burn this world to ash," she said sharply. "With or without you." The Slayer did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the sky. Argent reserves flickered at low baseline. Systems stable, but margins razor-thin. He could fight ground forces indefinitely. Orbital annihilation was another matter entirely. Chaos chose that moment to strike. The warp surged violently as the Imperium reacted to the Imperium's mobilization like a wounded beast cornered. Storm clouds thickened unnaturally, lightning clawing downward in colors that hurt to perceive. Reality tore open in multiple locations. Demonic incursions erupting simultaneously across the region. This was not coincidence. This was bait. From the heart of the storm, a voice rolled across the battlefield, vast, layered, and dripping with cruel amusement. "You run, little weapon. You exhaust yourself. You bleed in a universe that will never end." A towering warp avatar forced itself into being, far larger than anything the Slayer had yet faced in this galaxy. It was not a single god's champion, but a composite manifestation, a deliberate convergence of hatred, entropy, excess, and change. Chaos, for once, had set aside rivalry. Ilthariel recoiled. "This is beyond even us." The Slayer stepped forward. Orbital targeting reticles tightened. Imperial commanders hesitated. Vox traffic exploding with overlapping demands. "Fire now. Risk empowering the warp surge. Hold fire. Risk losing the anomaly and the world." Voss clenched his jaw. "All batteries, stand by." The daemon avatar descended, its mere presence bending gravity and tearing buildings apart as if made of paper. Daemons poured from its shadow like parasites from a wound. The warp storm intensified, feeding the construct with raw unreality. The Slayer charged. The impact shook the world. Every strike he delivered was met with resistance that tested his armor and his dwindling energy reserves to their limits. Warp lashes tore through plating, ripping away systems that had survived hell itself. His HUD fragmented warnings, cascading faster than they could be acknowledged. Argent energy spiked, and then dipped dangerously close to depletion. Critical threshold approaching. The Avatar laughed. "You are finite." The Slayer answered by tearing into the creature's core, pouring everything he had left into a sustained assault that shattered sigils and destabilized the convergence, holding it together. The backlash was catastrophic. Warp energy exploded outward, flattening kilometers of terrain and sending shockwaves that rattled Imperial ships in orbit. For a moment, everything froze. Then the Avatar began to collapse, its composite form unraveling under the strain of annihilation that did not return to the warp. The Imperium screamed as something fundamental was denied again. The Slayer staggered, dropping to one knee. Argent reserves bottomed out. Emergency protocols engaged. Known essential systems shut down. Armor integrity compromised. Movement slowed to a crawl. He was exposed. Ilthariel moved instantly, grabbing his arm with impossible strength. "Now!" she shouted. A webway gate flared open behind them, reality folding in on itself with alien precision. Eldar warriors poured covering fire into the demonic remnants as the Imperium's targeting solutions reasserted themselves. Voss saw it happen. "Fire!" he roared. Lance strikes tore into the planet's surface, obliterating the battlefield in pillars of white-hot annihilation. The ground vaporized. Daemons ceased to exist in screaming flashes of light. But the target was gone. The webway snapped shut an instant before the firestorm consumed everything. Silence fell over the bridge of the Lex Talionis. Voss stared at the empty hololith, fists clenched so tightly his augmetics groaned. "He escaped," Silex said quietly. "Yes," Voss replied. "Into Xenos' hands. That may be worse." Voss said nothing. He was already recalculating. The anomaly was wounded now, low on energy, forced to rely on others. That made him vulnerable. Within the shifting, unreal corridors of the webway, the Slayer collapsed fully for the first time since arriving in this galaxy. His armor locked into a defensive crouch, systems flickering weakly as Argent energy trickled back in agonizingly slow pulses. Ilthariel watched him carefully, fear and fascination warring in her eyes. "You are not invincible," she said softly. The Slayer pushed himself upright anyway. The webway echoed with distant, alien sounds, paths, branching into futures even the Eldar could barely comprehend. Somewhere beyond those paths, chaos raged and the Imperium plotted. Necrons calculated. Orcs fought among themselves. And in the center of it all stood a wounded, unyielding weapon that refused to stop. The galaxy had tried to crush him between gods and empires. It had failed, but the war had only just entered its most dangerous phase. The webway was not a place meant for endurance. Even the Eldar, who had walked its paths since before humanity learned to shape fire, treated it with wary respect. Its corridors twisted through impossible dimensions, geometry folding in on itself according to logic older than physics. Light bent strangely here, colors shifting without source, sound traveling in echoes that sometimes arrived before the cause. For the Slayer, it was hostile in a subtler way than the warp. There was no screaming madness, no demonic pressure clawing at his mind. Instead, there was absence, no familiar ambient violence to feed Argent regeneration, no predictable resistance to push against. His armor flagged the environment as non-combative, but energy inert, a combination that slowed recovery to a crawl. Argent reserves rose in shallow increments, then plateaued again. Ilthariel watched him from a respectful distance as they moved through the glowing passages, Eldar warriors flanking them with weapons half raised. She could sense his condition, even without psychic probing. Whatever fueled him was wounded, not broken, but strained. "You bleed," she said at last, breaking the silence. The Slayer did not answer. She continued anyway. "Not in the way mortals do. You bleed potential. Every time you fight here, you spend something this universe does not willingly give back." He stopped walking. Ilthariel tensed slightly, but he did not turn on her. Instead, he looked down at his gauntleted hands, flexing fingers that still trembled faintly from energy starvation. Damage reports scrolled across his HUD, systems compensating but unable to fully stabilize. He understood the implication. Hell had always pushed back. That resistance had fed him, driven him, sustained him. The 41st millennium was different. Here, suffering was endless, but it was managed, regulated, weaponized. The warp fed on despair, but it recycled it endlessly. Nothing truly ended, except what he touched. He resumed walking. The webway disgorged them into a hidden Eldar outpost nestled within the hollowed shell of a dead starship, its ancient hull woven seamlessly into the extra-dimensional space. Crystalline structures pulsed with soft light, humming with restrained power. Here, Ilthariel gestured for him to rest, if such a concept applied. "You cannot keep fighting as you have," she said, finally speaking plainly. "Not here. This galaxy will grind you down through attrition, not force. Chaos will adapt. The Imperium will escalate. You will become inefficient." The Slayer turned his helm toward her. She met his gaze steadily. "You do not belong to fate. That makes you rare, valuable. But even you must choose where to stand, or you will be pulled apart by every side. She showed him visions, not through psychic assault, but by projecting holo images culled from probability matrices and intercepted transmissions. Imperial strategia plotting sector-wide purges. Chaos cults restructuring rituals specifically to counter him. Necron dynasties flagging his signature as a long-term anomaly, requiring eventual elimination. All of them will hunt you, Ilthariel said softly, relentlessly, indefinitely. The Slayer watched without visible reaction. Or, she continued, you could choose targets that matter. Strike where the galaxy truly bleeds. Not endlessly, decisively. He understood that too. She was offering guidance, a way to conserve energy by choosing battles with lasting impact, a way to turn his finite presence into something sharper, more strategic. It made sense. That was the problem. He remembered the settlement in the canyon, the captain's voice, the people who had lived because he stayed when logic said he should leave. Those lives had not mattered to the galaxy. They had mattered to him. He turned away from the projections. Ilthariel's expression shifted surprise, then something like respect. You will not be guided, she said. You will not be efficient. The Slayer began checking his weapons, reloading deliberately despite the tremor in his hands. Systems responded sluggishly, but they responded. Ilthariel sighed. Then understand this. Every choice you make to save the insignificant drains you further. One day, you will be too weak to stop anything at all. The Slayer paused, then activated an external audio channel for the first time since arriving in this galaxy. His voice was distorted, mechanical, but unmistakably resolute. That day hasn't come. Ilthariel closed her eyes briefly. So be it. She arranged passage back into real space, opening a gate that would deposit him near a cluster of worlds, already spiraling toward chaos collapse. A place where his presence could make a difference, small, brutal, and costly. Before he stepped through, she spoke once more. If you fall, anomaly, this galaxy will not change. It will simply continue. The Slayer stepped into the light without looking back. He emerged onto a world in the midst of slow death. Hive spires sagged under centuries of neglect. Manufactoria choked on their own waste. The Imperium still ruled here technically, but its grip was weak, its promises hollow. Chaos cults flourished in the shadows, feeding on despair that never quite boiled over into open rebellion. The Slayer moved through the Underhive first. He killed quietly at first cult leaders, ritual circles, daemon hosts caught before manifestation. Each kill cost him, argent energy flaring weakly and then settling again at that same stubborn baseline. He could feel the drain now, a constant pressure, like fighting with one lung collapsed. Still, he pressed on. In the upper hive, things escalated. Open rebellion, daemons in the streets, PDF forces overwhelmed and breaking. The Slayer entered the chaos like a scalpel, carving through enemy strongpoints with surgical brutality that allowed civilians to flee, that bought time. It was working, but it was killing him. By the time the last warp breach collapsed, his armor was barely holding together. Argent levels hovered just above critical shutdown. His movements were slower, heavier. Each step demanded conscious effort. He stood atop a ruined spire and looked out over the city he had saved. It would fall again someday, he knew that. The galaxy demanded endless war, endless sacrifice, endless blood. He could not end that, but he could refuse to become what it wanted, a weapon optimized for despair rather than purpose. Far above, Inquisitor Voss watched reports of the anomaly's latest actions scroll across his console. Slower, more selective, less catastrophic. He's choosing, Voss murmured. Yes, Silex agreed. Poorly, perhaps. Voss's eyes hardened. No, dangerously. Because a being that chose meaning over efficiency was not something the Imperium could predict. And unpredictability, in the 41st millennium, was the greatest threat of all. The edict to purge came without ceremony. In the war rooms of the Lex Talionis, Inquisitor Voss sealed the order with a single press of his augmetic hand. 100 subordinate voices spoke litanies of affirmation as orbiting cruisers realigned their guns. To the Imperium, mercy and hesitation were synonyms for failure. A world that produced an uncontrollable weapon was already judged. Target: the anomaly's last recorded theater, Voss said. Exterminatus classification, sanctified justification, deviation of the flesh. The command was transmitted down the Vox chain like a psalm. Within minutes, cyclonic torpedoes slid from their launch tubes, engines glowing with apocalyptic grace. The planet below its population, exhausted by civil war and daemon incursions, would soon be reduced to ash. Silex dared to question him. If he still walks among them, Lord, then his death is the Emperor's will. The falling world, the Slayer felt it before instruments confirmed it. The pressure of mass weapons breaking atmosphere, the steady rumble of doom. His armor parsed trajectories. Time to impact 15 minutes. He could survive orbital fire for a while, but not the chain reaction that would follow. He stood atop the hive spire he had saved. The wind, thick with ashes from earlier battles. The sky was a wound of descending fire. Around him, the people he had protected were already praying, some to the Emperor, some to anything that might listen. None of them expected salvation. He could have left. Ilthariel's coordinates were still encoded within his systems. A stable webway gate, several kilometers east. Escape was mathematically feasible. Instead, he turned toward the evacuation lines where thousands still waited for shuttles that would never arrive. His internal diagnostics screamed warnings. Argent levels minimal. Armor integrity at 43%. Heat buildup critical. He began to move. Fire and faith. The first torpedo struck the outer continent. The ground heaved. Shockwaves traveled faster than sound. Whole cities vanished into incandescent craters. The Slayer sprinted through collapsing streets, shoving debris aside, clearing paths for panicked civilians. Lasphir and screams filled the air. PDF remnants fought riots as looters turned on each other. Even now, humanity found time for madness. The Slayer ignored it, cutting through a fallen hab block with his bare hands to open an escape route. From orbit, Voss watched the planetary hololith flicker with thermal spikes. "He endures still," he murmured. "How?" Silex's voice trembled. "He's helping them." The Inquisitor's jaw tightened. Helping is not obedience. The return of the dead. The Necrons returned with mechanical punctuality. From the deepest ruins, teleportation sigils flared emerald green as their constructs reactivated. The orbital assault had awakened ancient systems buried beneath the hive foundations. To them, the Slayer was the signal of interference, the anomaly that had once crippled a tomb network. They came for recalibration. A phalanx of immortals materialized amid the firestorm, Gauss weapons humming. Civilians died in the first volley, vaporized before they could even scream. The Slayer was already among them, his movements slower but still precise. He targeted spinal conduits, dismembering metallic limbs, ripping cores apart. For every Necron he destroyed, another rose from translocation arrays. The planet's destruction had become a three-way extermination. Imperial bombardment from above, Necron cleansing from below, and one dying warrior caught between. He pushed forward, leading survivors toward the East Ridge. The webway's threshold. Ilthariel felt the world dying through psychic echo. In her chamber beyond space, runes flickered out one by one. Against the advice of her council, she reopened the gate, extending a narrow corridor through the webway. Her voice reached across the storm like a whisper at the edge of thought. "Come through, Slayer of Gods. Your war is not here." He heard it. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, he hesitated. He looked back at the columns of people still moving, dragging the wounded, carrying children through molten dust. The sky rained fire. A torpedo broke apart overhead, its fragments burning like false stars. He could save some, not all, never all. The gate pulsed brighter. Ilthariel shouted again through the psychic noise, "If you stay, you die for nothing." The Slayer picked up a fallen child and handed her to a woman whose eyes were wide with disbelief. Then he turned away from the gate. Ilthariel's mind reeled. Foolish, impossible creature. The portal began to collapse, severed by Imperial interference, judgment from the heavens. Voss gave the final order: detonate the remaining payloads. 12 cyclonic torpedoes ignited at once. The stratosphere turned white. The planet's crust shattered, oceans boiling instantly. Through it all, Auspex feeds showed one last anomaly: a point of heat and motion cutting through collapsing city canyons, surrounded by thousands of smaller life signs moving with him. The Inquisition's bridge fell silent as the surface vanished beneath a continent-sized firestorm. "Signal lost," Silex whispered. Voss exhaled. "Then it is finished." But deep within the ashes of the dying world, something refused to yield: the endless advance. The Slayer crawled out of a trench of molten glass, armor blackened, systems barely functioning. Atmospheric pressure warnings filled his visor, oxygen content minimal. Around him, a handful of survivors stumbled blindly, protected by nothing but his presence. His argent core flickered faintly. Against all reason, it had not extinguished. He hauled the nearest survivor to his feet, gesturing toward a collapsed transport tunnel that might shield them from the next wave of destruction. They followed, wordless, trusting the silent titan whose mere existence defied apocalypse. Hours passed, or minutes. Time was meaningless amid planetary death. The bombardment faded at last, replaced by the groan of a world cracking apart. They reached the tunnel's end. Beyond lay a crater large enough to swallow a city, and, at its center, an object fallen from orbit, a Mechanicus drop pod, twisted but intact. Inside, emergency life support units still functioned. The Slayer forced the hatch open and began guiding survivors inside one by one. The pod would not fly, but its shielding might last long enough. He stepped back into the inferno, sealing the hatch behind them. The world above screamed and finally broke. The Inquisition's silence. Weeks later, fragments of Voss's fleet drifted near the system's remains. Scans confirmed total planetary annihilation. Yet one report, buried in corrupted data, described a single object escaping the final blast, a chunk of debris moving under its own propulsion for several seconds before disappearing from Auspex range. Voss stared at the incomplete file until his augmetic eyes began to glitch. "Erase this," he ordered. "If he lives, we will find him elsewhere." Silex hesitated. "And if we cannot, then the Emperor will have to manage his own vengeance." The survivor, far below the notice of any sensor, deep in the void between worlds, a lone escape pod drifted silently. Inside, life signs flickered weakly, but persisted. The survivors, huddled together, kept alive by a failing reactor that still emitted faint traces of unfamiliar energy. Outside, tethered to the pod by a single cable, the Slayer floated motionless in the dark, armor locked in stasis mode to conserve the last drops of argent power. Stars reflected on the cracked surface of his visor, each one a reminder of how vast the war truly was. He had saved dozens out of billions. It was enough. Within his chest, the argent core pulsed, once faint, but steady. The galaxy had tried to erase him. The Imperium had judged him. The gods of the warp had united to destroy him. Yet still, in the silence between dying stars, he endured. And endurance, in the 41st millennium, was the rarest miracle of all. The void between stars is never truly empty. It is a graveyard of failed migrations, forgotten wars, and the quiet drift of things that survived when they should not have. The escape pod drifted through that darkness for weeks, its trajectory altered only by microbursts of failing thrusters and the occasional gravitational whisper of distant systems. Inside, the survivors slept in fitful shifts, sustained by ration paste and fear. Outside, tethered to the hull like a sentinel carved from scorched metal, the Slayer endured. His armor remained in deep stasis, systems pared down to the barest essentials. Argent energy output was almost non-existent, cycling in faint pulses that barely registered. Every diagnostic confirmed the same truth. One more catastrophic engagement without recovery would end him permanently. Not banish, not delay, end. He accepted this without emotion. The silence broke when the warp did. It began as a pressure, subtle enough that even the survivors inside the pod did not notice. The void rippled, stars elongating into streaks as unreality bled through real space. The Slayer's armor flared warnings instantly, emergency systems clawing for power as dormant sensors snapped awake. Warp translation without a vessel. Something was forcing itself into existence. The escape pod shuddered violently as the Imperium tore open around it, a vast, rotating scar of color and screaming geometry. From within emerged shapes that did not fully resolve, their forms fluctuating as if reality rejected them. These were not common demons. They were thin, refined things, hunters, shaped by intent rather than hunger. A voice echoed directly into the Slayer's systems, bypassing auditory channels entirely. "You persist," it said, layered with contempt. Even now, the Slayer released the stasis lock. His armor screamed in protest as systems reactivated at emergency capacity. Argent reserves flickered dangerously low, but functional. He reeled the tether in and planted himself against the pod's hull, bracing as warp energies lashed the void around him. The daemons attacked. They moved with purpose, coordinating their strikes, phasing in and out of reality to avoid retaliation. Warp lances carved furrows through his armor, breaching outer layers and forcing emergency reroutes. Pain registered distant, muted, but real. He fought anyway. Every movement was slower now, heavier. Each shot was chosen with ruthless care. He could not afford waste. When ammunition ran dry, he closed the distance, tearing at warp forms with gauntleted hands, crushing cohesion points, annihilating entities before they could fully stabilize. Still, more came. The warp scar widened, its edges crystallizing into something deliberate. From it stepped a figure that dwarfed the others, its form a towering amalgam of sorcery and arrogance. It wore the semblance of armor forged from belief itself, sigils of patronage etched deep into its being. "A herald, you are a lesson that must be erased," it declared. Not for defiance, but for example. The Slayer launched himself at it, the impact sending shockwaves through the void. They clashed amid swirling unreality, each strike tearing chunks from existence itself. The herald wielded power that bent causality, rewriting outcomes mid-motion, turning killing blows into glancing impacts. The Slayer adapted, compensating not for strength, but for intent. He watched the moment before reality shifted and struck there instead, forcing the herald to react rather than dictate. Argent energy flared briefly, then dipped again. Critical threshold. The herald laughed as it sensed the drain. "You are emptying yourself," it taunted. "This galaxy will starve you." The Slayer answered by driving a blade of concentrated argent straight through the herald's core, pouring everything he had left into the strike. The feedback was catastrophic. Warp energy detonated inward, collapsing the scar in on itself and annihilating the lesser daemons instantly. The herald screamed as it unraveled, its essence consumed by annihilation that offered no return. The warp recoiled. The void fell silent once more. The Slayer drifted, armor locked again by emergency systems, as argent levels flatlined just above zero. He could not move, could not fight. If anything else came now, it would end him. Inside the pod, one of the survivors noticed the sudden stillness and peered through a viewport. She gasped softly at the sight of the armored figure floating there, scorched and motionless, still tethered protectively to their fragile shelter. "He's still there," she whispered. They did not know how close they had come to death. Hours later, long-range sensors aboard a passing vessel detected the pod's weak distress signal. It was not an Imperial ship. Its hull bore no aquila, no sigils of sanctioned authority. It was a Void Trader's vessel, old, scarred, and very cautious. The captain debated ignoring the signal. Space was full of traps, but curiosity, or perhaps pity, won out. Salvage crews approached carefully, mag boots clanking as they moved along the pod's hull. They froze when they saw the armored giant tethered beside it, weapons scarred, armor cracked, but unmistakably intact. "What in the void is that?" one whispered. The Slayer did not move. The captain made a decision that would haunt and define him in equal measure. "Bring them aboard," he ordered. All of them. They cut the tether and hauled the pod into the cargo bay. The Slayer followed, dragged carefully, treated with a reverence born of fear. As the bay sealed and atmosphere rushed back in, the armor's systems detected a change. Pressure, oxygen, heat. Argent energy stirred faintly. Not much, not enough, but enough to signal survival. In the quiet of the trader's hold, the Slayer remained still, conserving what little strength he had left. He had defied the Imperium's judgment. He had wounded chaos deeply enough to draw targeted annihilation. He had saved lives at the cost of his own longevity. This galaxy would not let him rest. But rest had never been part of his design. Somewhere far away, deep within the Imperium, something older and more calculating than rage took notice of the Herald's erasure and began preparing a response not built on force alone. And as the trader vessel turned toward safer lanes, unknowingly carrying the most dangerous anomaly of the age, the war entered a phase where gods and empires alike would learn a bitter truth. There were still things in the universe that refused to die quietly. The Void Trader vessel, Sanctity of Prophet, was a contradiction wrapped in corroded plasteel. Its nameplate still carried the faded scorch marks of an imperial registry, but its hull was patched with non-standard alloys, its auger arrays upgraded with half-legal components, its corridors lined with icons to saints the crew no longer truly believed would answer. It smelled of machine oil, stale incense, and the sour tang of recycled air, an old ship's breath, steady and tired. Captain Hest Varro walked the length of his cargo bay with a caution that bordered on superstition. Around him, his crew kept their distance from the thing they had hauled aboard. The escape pod sat like a bruise against the bulkheads. The survivors, gaunt, ash-streaked, eyes wide with the shock of living past their expiration date, were being escorted to quarantine. But the other salvage, that was the problem. The armored giant lay on a reinforced deck plate, tethered now by grav clamps and a nervous perimeter of armed crewmen. It hadn't moved since they'd recovered it. It hadn't spoken. It hadn't even breathed in any way the Medicae scanners could interpret. And yet the ship's machine spirit, temperamental at the best of times, had stopped protesting for the first time in years, as if the presence of the Slayer made even the ancient systems hesitate. Varro had seen xenos relics, warp-tainted idols, and Mechanicus prototypes, so classified they came with kill switches. None of them made the hairs on the back of his neck rise like this did. His first mate, Della Kine, approached with a datapad held like a shield. "Captain," she murmured, "the survivors say he saved them, pulled them through bombardment, fought off something in the void." Varro's eyes never left the armored figure. The helm's green optics were dark now, like dead stars. "And what do you think it is?" Della swallowed. "Not a space marine." "No," Varro agreed. "Space marines don't look like that, and they don't lie still like cargo." A vox chime pinged overhead. "Captain," the ship's auger officer called, "we're picking up a signal. Tight beam. Origin. Unknown. It's tracking us." Varro's jaw tightened. "Imperial?" "Negative. Patterns. Wrong. Clean. Like a machine's heartbeat." Varro's blood ran cold. "Necron? Could be." Varro looked back at the Slayer and understood with a sick certainty that they had not recovered salvage. They had recovered a war. "Get us into the nearest drift lane," he snapped. "Hard burn. No broadcasts." They ran. For 6 hours, the Sanctity of Prophet pushed its engines to the edge of rebellion. The hull groaned. The reactors ran hot. Servitors prayed in monotone as coolant lines hissed steam and the ship's Saint icons rattled on chains. Still, the tracking signal remained steady behind them, like a patient predator refusing to tire. Then the warp began to whisper. It started as small things. Crewmen hearing their names spoken from empty corridors. A deckhand swearing he saw a shadow move against the wrong light source. The ship's chapel candles flaring green for a heartbeat before returning to normal flame. Vero's navigator, a pale, sickly woman sealed behind warded glass, began to tremble in her throne, her third eye twitching beneath its stitched lid. "Captain," she whispered over the intercom, voice strained. "Something is watching us. Not the usual hunger. This is intent." Varro gripped his command rail. "Can you make the jump?" The navigator hesitated, and that hesitation was the most terrifying sound Varro had ever heard. "Yes, but not safely. Do it anyway," Varro said. They translated into the warp. The transition hit like drowning. The ship lurched, its reality skin scraping against a sea of impossible color. The Geller field flared, held barely by the prayers of machines and men who did not fully understand what they were begging for. For a moment, Varro felt relief. Then the warp smiled. A pressure pressed against the ship's hull from the outside, gentle, inquisitive, like fingers tracing glass. The navigator screamed. Vox channels erupted in static-laced laughter. The crew began to shout, pointing at the viewing ports where faces formed in the roiling madness beyond, pressing close, grinning with too many teeth. "Geller stability dropping!" someone screamed. Varro's mind snapped to the only constant in the cargo bay. "The armored one," he said. "Bring him to the bridge. Now." Dilla stared. "Captain, he's—" "Now," Varro roared. Crewmen ran, maglocks clanking, weapons shaking in their hands. They released the grav clamps and hauled the Slayer's inert mass onto a cargo sled, dragging him through corridors that now felt longer than they had any right to be. Servitors along the way began to chant in harsher tones, their machine voices glitching into discord. Halfway to the bridge, the first daemon appeared. It slid through a hairline crack in reality, thin and sharp as a nightmare, less a creature than a concept with claws. It lunged at a crewman, and the man's scream cut off as his soul was pulled from his body like thread from cloth. More followed, emerging as the Geller field faltered under concentrated, deliberate pressure. This wasn't a random incursion. This was a trap. Varro heard the laughter now too, deep and layered, echoing through the ship's metal bones. A voice crawled across the Vox, warm with mockery. "You carry my wound," it purred, "so I will open you and look inside." The daemons converged on the cargo sled like carrion birds. And that was when the Slayer's optics flared green. The sudden light hit the corridor like sunrise in a tomb. The air snapped with pressure as dormant systems woke violently, emergency reserves clawing up from near nothing. Argent energy pulsed weak, but real, reacting not to comfort, but to threat. The Slayer stood. Crewmen stumbled back, relief and terror mixing into something like worship. The daemons paused for a fraction of a second, an impossible moment of hesitation. Then the Slayer moved. It was not the unstoppable storm of his earlier rampages. His motions were heavier, slightly delayed, as if each action had to be purchased with pain. But the precision remained. The intent remained. He fired once, twice, each shot tearing a daemon apart so completely that the warp screamed in protest. He advanced, ripping through the thin horrors with brutal economy, refusing to waste energy on flourish. The corridor became a slaughterhouse. But the pressure outside the hull intensified, as if the warp itself leaned closer, fascinated by this wounded predator that still bared teeth. The ship shuddered. The Geller field sputtered again, and a second wave of entities began to form, larger this time, more stable, their bodies wrapped in symbols of deliberate containment, a constructed countermeasure, shaped by gods and fed by spite. At their center manifested something that made even the Slayer's systems spike warnings, a demonic executioner bound with sigils designed not to kill him, but to drain him, an inverse engine, a hungry framework meant to starve Argent itself by forcing it to burn too fast. It raised a blade that was not metal but denial. The Slayer lunged anyway. Their clash sent a shock through the ship that blew out lumen strips and threw men to the deck. The Executioner struck with a parasitic precision, each hit siphoning energy, each cut widening the gap between the Slayer's will and his failing reserves. Argent levels plummeted. His armor's warnings turned from red to emergency black. Critical depletion imminent. The Executioner laughed without a mouth. "Finite," it hissed. "You are finite." The Slayer's response was not rage. It was decision. He looked past the Executioner, past the corridor toward the bridge, where the ship's core systems held the only chance of survival. He did not need to win forever. He needed to win now. He baited the Executioner forward, letting it overcommit to a draining strike, then slammed his gauntlet into the daemon's chest and held on, locking it in place like a circuit breaker pinned by brute force. The Executioner thrashed, blade carving gouges into his armor, siphoning more and more power. Argent drained to a hair above zero. And the Slayer triggered an overcharge. Not a blast of excess, but a controlled detonation. Argent energy forced into a tight, internal loop that burned through the Executioner's sigils from the inside out, turning its draining framework into a conduit for its own annihilation. The daemon screamed as its purpose collapsed, its structure melting into ash that did not return to the warp. The backlash slammed into the Slayer like a hammer. He dropped to one knee. For a heartbeat, his optics flickered, dimmed. The crew held their breath, staring at him as if the universe itself had paused. Then his optics flared again, steadier. He stood, slower now, but upright. The remaining daemons hesitated, the warp's pressure shifting from amusement to irritation. The voice on the Vox snarled, no longer playful. Enough. The ship lurched as something vast moved outside the Geller field, not breaking it yet, but pressing so hard that reality creaked. The navigator screamed again, her mind flooded with the image of a colossal eye opening in the storm. Varro, blood on his lip, shouted over the chaos. "Bridge now!" The Slayer turned and moved, every step heavy, each motion the choice of a creature refusing shutdown. The crew followed, fighting in his wake. When they reached the bridge, the navigator was barely conscious, her hands clawing at her restraints. "I can," she gasped. "I can't hold it." Varro looked at the Slayer. "Can you do anything?" The Slayer stepped to the viewing port and stared into the warp storm beyond the glass. The colossal pressure shifted, as if meeting his gaze. For a moment, predator regarded predator across an ocean of madness. Then the Slayer reached into the ship's systems not with code, but with raw, violent improvisation. He tore open a maintenance panel, ripped out a conduit feeding the Geller field, and rerouted it through a compact Argent capacitor embedded in his armor's core. The interface sparked. Alarms screamed. The ship's machine spirit wailed in binary outrage. And then the Geller field surged, hardening like a clenched fist. The warp howled as the sudden reinforcement shoved it back, sealing cracks, denying entry. The colossal pressure recoiled slightly, not defeated, but interrupted. The navigator sobbed with relief. "Now," she whispered. "Now I can jump." Varro didn't wait. "Do it." The ship lurched again, then tore free, translating violently back into real space. Stars snapped into place. Silence replaced the warp's laughter. The bridge crew collapsed, shaking, some praying, some laughing hysterically. Warning lights still flashed, but they were real warnings now. Heat damage, overload, not the metaphysical shriek of being eaten alive. Varro turned to the Slayer. The armored figure stood motionless, one hand still sunk into torn wiring, smoke curling from his gauntlet. Argent levels were nearly flatlined again. His posture was rigid, like something holding itself together through sheer insistence. He had saved them. Again. But the cost was written in the way his armor trembled, the faint stutter in his optics. Varro swallowed hard. "Whatever you are," he said hoarsely, "the whole galaxy, is going to come for you. The Slayer removed his hand from the conduit and looked out at the stars, where Imperial space waited with its judgment and chaos waited with its hunger. Then he began to walk toward the ship's exit hatch, as if the war outside were merely the next corridor to clear. The stars outside the viewport looked clean, almost peaceful pinpricks of light scattered across a black so deep it felt like a promise. Captain Varro knew better. Peace was what you called the moment before someone decided you were worth killing. The armored giant walking down his corridor was worth killing to nearly everyone. Crewmen watched from doorways, clutching rosaries, knives, and rifles with equal uncertainty. None stepped into the Slayer's path. He didn't look at them. He moved like a verdict. Delakine caught up to Varro, breathless. Captain, Imperial signatures. 3 ships on intercept. They're broadcasting orders to heave to. On the bridge, the augur plot showed sharp triangles of authority. An Arbite's cutter, a Navy frigate, and worst of all, a black inquisitorial corvette with its transponder masked behind sealed codes. Voss had not forgotten. He had simply widened the net. The Slayer stepped onto the bridge and looked at the holo display. His optics glowed faintly, steadier than they had in the warp, but still carrying the stutter of exhaustion. Argent levels remained dangerously low, rising only in shallow pulses. He watched the closing ships. Then he turned to the airlock controls. Varro stepped forward. "Hold on. If you step out there, they'll tear this ship apart to find you. You could hide aboard. We could run." The Slayer stopped, just long enough to let Varro finish. Then he looked back at the holo display, at the certainty of the intercept, at the inevitable collateral. Running would doom them. Staying would doom them. So he chose the only option that kept the innocent from paying his price. He made himself the target in the open. He keyed the external hatch. Maglocks disengaged with a heavy clunk. The airlock cycled, pressure dropping, frost blooming on metal. The Slayer stepped inside and sealed the inner door behind him. Varro slammed a fist against the viewport. "Emperor, damn it!" The outer hatch opened. The Slayer stepped into the void. Thrusters ignited in brief, controlled bursts, nudging him toward the incoming fleet like a bullet choosing its own trajectory. On the inquisitorial corvette, Inquisitor Malrek Voss watched the live feed with grim satisfaction. He presents himself. That confirms intent. Silex's augmetics word. Intent to protect the vessel, Lord. He's separating from it. Voss's gaze stayed hard. Existence is the crime. He opened a channel. Anomaly. Surrender for containment. Compliance may spare the civilians you have entangled. The Slayer did not respond. He accelerated. The Navy frigate fired first, lance batteries stitching pale light through the darkness. The beams struck the Slayer's armor and scattered, energy diffusing across plating that should have failed. He rolled with the impacts, thrusters correcting, closing the distance with relentless purpose. Point defense cannons opened up. Flak detonated around him in blooming spheres. Shrapnel pinged off his armor. Argent levels dipped from emergency shielding. He kept moving. The Arbite's cutter launched boarding torpedoes aimed not at him, but at the trader ship. The Slayer's optics snapped toward them. He changed course instantly, intercepting in open space. He collided with one and ripped it apart before it reached its target, then caught another and hurled it back hard enough to punch through the cutter's forward plating. The detonation inside the vessel tore it open like fruit. Varro watched from his bridge, throat tight. "He just threw it," Della whispered. Varro's hands hovered over the ship-wide broadcast rune. One order and he could jettison the anomaly, pretend ignorance, beg the Imperium for mercy. He imagined Arbite's boarding parties and inquisitorial interrogations, the way confessionals ended with a bolt round. He imagined the pod survivors still shaking, still alive, being spaced as contaminants for standing too near the wrong kind of miracle. He let his hand fall away. Pleading would only change who died first. On the corvette, Voss listened to the channel's silence and felt certainty try and fail to settle. A daemon could be explained. A xenos could be categorized. This thing was a question with teeth, and doctrine felt suddenly small. When the Slayer intercepted the torpedoes, fragments rattled the void like hail. "He's choosing targets," Silex murmured. "Protecting the traitor." "Manipulation," Voss snapped, though the words sounded thin. Manipulation required language. This was arithmetic. Innocence on one side, authority on the other, and the anomaly subtracting threats without permission. As the Grey Knights launched, their Justicar's voice chimed on encrypted vox, iron-hard and controlled. "Inquisitor, we will bind it. If it is a weapon, we claim it. If it is a monster, we end it." Voss answered, "Do not underestimate it." "I do not," the Justicar replied. "I recognize competence." That single word felt like blasphemy on the bridge. Voss swallowed the impulse to rebuke him. Pride killed more worlds than heresy ever had. Out in the void, the Slayer felt the Knight's discipline like a new pressure, unwavering purpose mirroring his own. For an instant, that symmetry threatened to slow his hand. Then the sister's null aura bit deeper, and pain clarified everything again. Voss's expression tightened. "Escalate." The corvette deployed a containment lattice shimmering fields projected outward, designed to entangle and immobilize. The lattice snapped shut around the Slayer like a net made of light. For a heartbeat, he slowed. Argent flow stuttered as the field tried to suppress unfamiliar energy signatures. Silex's voice was cautious. "Lord, the field is interacting unpredictably." "Fire," Voss said. A Nova cannon shot struck the lattice dead center. Light flared outward like a second sun. The containment field shattered. Debris scattered. When the glare faded, the Slayer still drifted. At the blast's heart armor cracked, pieces venting, but intact. His optics flickered. Argent levels bottomed out, then rose by a fraction, reacting to the violence like a lung drawing one desperate breath. He moved again. Not fast, not clean, but forward. He angled toward the corvette. If he could reach it, he could end the pursuit directly. Voss recognized the trajectory and smiled thinly. Let him come. The corvette's bay doors opened not for ships, but for people. Sisters of Silence launched in void suits etched with null sigils, their presence and absence even across vacuum. Behind them came Grey Knights in storm harnesses, halberds glowing with warded power. The sisters' null aura hit the Slayer like cold chains. Argent flow stuttered violently. His thrusters faltered. For the first time in open space, he truly slowed. The Grey Knights struck with disciplined violence, halberds biting into cracked plating, psychic force slamming into him like waves against rock. The Slayer reeled, then fought back with brutal economy, seizing a knight's wrist and twisting until Ceramite screamed, hurling the armored body into another. He could kill them. He knew that. But every kill here would feed the Imperium's certainty. Every death would justify worlds burning to stop him. So he disabled instead of slaughtering. A helm cracked. A weapon arm was torn free and spun away into the void. The knights fell back, stunned by an opponent who refused the simplest victory. Voss watched, eyes narrowing. He's restraining himself. Silex swallowed. That's not what daemons do. Voss's voice went quieter. No, that's what zealots do. The sisters closed in, null blades cutting deeper than any warplash, carving into systems that sparked and failed. Argent levels dipped to near nothing. The Slayer's movements slowed to a crawl. He surged forward one last time, slamming into the corvette's hull and tearing at its plating with bare hands. Metal screamed. Warning, klaxons blared inside the ship. "Contain him," Voss ordered. "Now, before he breaches." A second lattice snapped into place, reinforced by null fields and layered wards. It crushed around the Slayer, pinning him against the hull like a specimen on a pinboard. Thrusters died. Argent flow flickered and went dim. Voss stepped into an observation blister, staring through reinforced glass at the trapped figure outside. It ends here. The Slayer's optics flickered. Then, impossibly, they steadied. He did not erupt in power. He did something worse for a man like Voss. He looked directly at him and tapped 2 fingers against the hull. Not a threat, a promise. Voss's skin prickled. He had never seen a weapon promise to outlast him. The warning sirens changed pitch. Silex's augmetics flared. Lord, warp rupture. Not near the anomaly, near us. Something is coming through. The void rippled. A rift opened, clean and surgical. Nothing like a chaotic breach. An Eldar craft slid out of it, angular and silent, emerging from the webway like a blade drawn from a sheath. Ilthariel's voice cut across comms, calm and cold. Release him, Mon-K. Your chains will doom you, Voss snarled. Xenos interference, fire. The frigate's lances swung toward the Eldar craft, and the warp screamed again as a second presence pressed through. Vast and furious, drawn by the convergence of null fields, psychic wards, and the anomaly's trapped ember. Demonic forms began to coalesce at the rift's edge, eager for a feast. Chaos had been waiting for this. In that instant, every faction's goals collided in a perfect, catastrophic knot. The Imperium's need to contain, the Eldar's attempt to salvage, Chaos's hunger to reclaim control. And at the center of it, pinned and silent, the Slayer waited. The galaxy had finally managed to stop him. Now it would learn what happens when it gathers all its monsters in one place and gives him a reason to rise again. Word count: 1,552. Conclusion: the 41st millennium did not change because one warrior arrived. It changed because the galaxy tried to file him into its familiar categories and failed. The Imperium saw a heresy that would not kneel, so it reached for cages and fire. The Eldar saw a rupture in fate, so it reached for guidance and leverage. Chaos saw a predator that did not feed the warp, so it reached for traps and tailored nightmares. None of them understood the simplest truth. He did not come to rule, convert, or be worshipped. He came to end what should not exist. Yet the longer he fought, the clearer the cost became. Argent power bled away in alien physics. Every saved settlement bought time, not victory. Every restrained blow against human defenders denied him the easy path and tightened the net around him. In a universe built to recycle suffering forever, decisive endings were an act of rebellion, and rebellions are expensive. Now he hangs in the void, pinned by sanctified lattices and null-forged absence, while an Eldar blade slips from the webway and the warp itself gathers like a storm front. The Imperium believes this is containment. Chaos believes it is a feast. The Eldar believes it is a pivot point. The Slayer believes none of it. Because whether the chains hold or shatter, the convergence has already rewritten the sector's future. If he breaks free, he will be surrounded by the galaxy's worst monsters at arm's reach, and proximity is a gift he never wastes. If he falls, then the warp will remember that something made it recoil for ages, and every god and inquisitor will sleep a little less soundly. In the grim darkness of the far future, even a single refusal can echo louder than prayer. The Emperor protects. More stories await.